Hello and welcome to this special episode of Inside Iraq from Washington, D.C. My name is Jassim Azzawi. In February 2003, former U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell stood before the United Nations Security Council and presented his country's case for war against Iraq. Critics charge that presentation was weak, inaccurate, and full of fraudulent evidence. What most people did not know at the time, Powell believed in those words despite some nagging doubts. Our guest today is aware of those nagging doubts. Our guest today is former Secretary of State Colin Powell, Chief of Staff Larry Wilkerson. Welcome to this special edition, Mr. Wilkerson. Those nagging doubts, were they born as a result of lack of evidence, lack of information, or the misinterpretation and potential misinterpretation of those evidence?
Thank you for having me here. That's a good question. I think the doubts came mostly from the fact that we had predominantly circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence, while convincing, is not the kind of evidence that you would like to have for such a fateful decision to send a nation to war. And also because what we had was evidence that came from other sources. That is to say, the United States did not have real intelligence sources on the ground in Iraq. And so we had to rely heavily on other intelligence services, the British, the Germans, the French, the Israelis, the Jordanians. We had not had any eyes on the ground in Iraq since President Clinton had bombed Iraq in 1998 and Saddam Hussein had essentially severed the relationship with the inspectors and so forth and removed them from his country. And so there was quite a period of years that all we could do is depend on other people's intelligence sources and depend on our national technical means, satellites and so forth, for what they could render about his programs. And that obviously was not adequate.
Perhaps that's unprecedented somehow for the U.S. to rely on other countries for such a weighty enterprise, and that is to go to war on evidence that they could not corroborate. Having said that, many intelligence agencies within the U.S., they had their doubts, they had dissension. Were these dissension presented to Colin Powell?
We have 5 really prominent intelligence agencies that we were dealing with routinely, and we have another 10 or so that we have to deal with in what we call the intelligence community. This is everything from the Central Intelligence Agency, with which most everyone's familiar now, to the National Security Agency, to the Defense Intelligence Agency, and so forth. The man who speaks for all those agencies is, as in the past, was the Director for Central Intelligence, at that time George Tenet, and his deputy, the DDCI, John McLaughlin. So when they spoke for all of the elements in the U.S. intelligence community, and they spoke in a decisive way. That is to say, George Tenet was the person advising the President of the United States and the National Security Council, of which Colin Powell was a member. So if there was dissension in the intelligence community, and as you indicate, there was some dissension, then that dissension is managed by the DCI. And the DCI makes the decision as to which side of an argument, if there are sides, that he comes down on. And the President and the Secretary of State and others they listen to the DCI, and they take normally what the DCI says as the verdict of the intelligence community.
Mr. Wilkerson, that begs the question. You and Secretary Powell spent days, if not perhaps weeks, in Virginia, in the headquarters of the CIA, perhaps next door to George Tenet. You were presented with most of the information, all of the information, and yet you are saying that those dissensions, some of those internal emails within the community were not given to the very man who was going to present the case for the United States in front of the international community.
That is correct. Some made it through to us. For example, our own Intelligence Bureau, which is one of those other 15 entities I was telling you about, our own Intelligence Bureau in the State Department dissented on the nuclear program. They maintained that Saddam Hussein had no active nuclear program. That dissent was made a footnote to the October 2002 National Intelligence Estimate, which was the estimate that we used as our backdrop, so to speak, as we prepared the Secretary's presentation.
Are you referring here to the aluminum tubes, or are you referring to something else?
Here I'm referring to the comprehensive decision to say, yes, he's got an active nuclear program, no, he doesn't have a nuclear program. And in this case, INR said their best evidence, their best analysis showed that he did not have an active nuclear program. The remainder of the intelligence community, however, and importantly, the DCI, who's over that community, said that they believed he did have an active nuclear program. And of course, that involved, as an ingredient of that assessment, the aluminum tubes.
Earlier, you mentioned the reliance on others. And one of the names that have become synonymous, perhaps, with this war and the potential damage to the U.S. interests for the long run is curveball. And within the dissension, there were a couple of emails regarding the inaccuracies and perhaps the fraudulent information garnered by curveball. In your opinion, why those emails were not presented to Colin Powell when the CIA had them?
This is an issue of major concern to me now after the presentation has been made and I've done research and I've discovered some of the things that you said.
Did you come up to a conclusion?
Well, I have listened to Tyler Drumheller, who was the head of CIA operations in Europe. I don't see any reason why he would be lying or fabricating. He has said that there was information available during the time that we were preparing, and that information discounted the reliability of a source whom I have subsequently learned was the principal source for the mobile biological laboratories. This is your curveball. We never heard about that doubt. We never saw that doubt expressed by the DCI or the DDCI. We never knew that there was a single source only. We were told there were 4 separate, independently corroborated sources for the biological labs. So yes, I have deep concern over that now as to why George Tenet and John McLaughlin did not tell the Secretary about that doubt, which Tyler Drumheller says he talked to them about extensively.
The Germans who had possession of curveball, they said, you know, he's a liar.
That's my understanding. My understanding is not just the Germans, but also, as I said, the head of the European division of the CIA, Tyler Drumheller, actually talked on the phone with John McLaughlin about his own doubts. And when he saw the script that we were preparing for Powell to give in New York, he weighed in again and said that Powell should not be saying this because the information was unreliable. And yet that never made it to the Secretary of State.
Mr. Wilkerson, let's come to the case officer of curveball, the master of curveball, if you like, Ahmed Chalabi. Did he actively, was he critical in the U.S. going to war based upon the fraudulent information that he furnished the U.S.?
In my subsequent research, I think I have found that Chalabi had an inordinate amount of influence, and his Iraqi National Congress and the contacts that they created had an inordinate amount of influence over the compilation of intelligence that was done by Douglas Feist's office in the Pentagon, Under Secretary of Defense for Policy Feist. I think that information essentially was the information that made it into the script that Secretary Powell was originally given by Scooter Libby in the Vice President's office at the White House for his presentation at the UN Security Council.
And yet, listening to Douglas Feist, he discounts very much the influence of Ahmed Chalabi and his influence, whether on Secretary Rumsfeld or Wolfowitz or on him.
I differ with that opinion, obviously. I believe Chalabi had significant influence on a number of decision makers, including Vice President Cheney.
Let's come to the second pillar, the second reason for the U.S. going to war, and that is the nexus between the Iraqi government and terrorism. Were the U.S. convinced that Iraq really is involved in international terrorism, again, despite the dissension of other intelligence agencies?
Well, here's another area where I have some deep concern about what happened at the CIA in those 5-6 days and nights that I virtually lived at Langley. We were debating the portions of Secretary Powell's presentation that described Saddam's contacts with terrorists. We almost got to the point where we were throwing the majority of it out. That is to say, Secretary Powell didn't believe any of it, didn't think it was relevant, didn't think it proved anything. We were about to eliminate it. We had a last-minute presentation on an interrogation of, as it was put at the time, and this is almost a direct quote, a high-level al-Qaeda operative, unquote.
This you are referring to
And later I determined that that was Sheikh al-Libi, and that he had confessed, and in that confession he had owned up to the fact that there were direct contacts between Saddam Hussein's people and al-Qaeda. In fact, those contacts included training by Saddam Hussein's Mukhabarat and training al-Qaeda operatives in the use of chemical and biological weapons. Well, this was stunning. This was coming from a high-level operative whom we had captured, and it was delivered to the Secretary of State, it was delivered to me, and we then decided that we would put that information in Secretary Powell's presentation, and it became the heart of his presentation on terrorism with regard to Saddam Hussein.
Mr. Wilkerson, before we take a break, was that evidence, that statement by him, was taken under duress?
I have subsequently learned that he was tortured in Egypt, that no U.S. personnel were present during that torture, that he was waterboarded, and that he confessed, as it were.
Mr. Wilkerson, we'll take a short break now, but when we come back, I'll ask you about Colin Powell's presentation to the United Nations Security Council. Stay with us.